Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. In this podcast, I talk to David Murray, the 8-bit guy, all about solar energy, his solar setup and my solar setup. But before I do that, I'll just let my longtime listeners know, yes, it's been a minute since I've uploaded a podcast. Shortly after recording this interview with David Murray, I was called by the museum to go last minute and document digging up dinosaur fossils in the Badlands of Wyoming. So if you're curious how that went, I recorded 7 or 8 podcasts every day in a row chronicling what it was like to dig for fossils in the Badlands of Wyoming. So in this podcast app, whatever your podcast app you're using to listen to the show, make sure you also subscribe to the HMNS Beyond Bones podcast. Just go to the search bar and type in HMNS Beyond Bones podcast, and that's where you can hear me doing the podcast about digging up fossils in Wyoming. You can also hear more podcasts there that I will be recording in the future as well. So anyways, without further ado, here's the interview between me and David Murray, the 8-bit guy, all about solar energy. Let's get into it. So today I'm having a longtime friend of the show and a friend in real life, David Murray, who you might know as the 8-bit guy. David, thank you for coming on Geek Therapy Radio again.
You're welcome.
Awesome. So a few months ago, I guess it was months, or was it like last year, you came down to Houston and I was kind of showing you, some of my geek things. And one of the things I showed you was my little solar panel array, my 780 watt solar panel array. And don't worry, listeners, we're going to get into some numbers and components and wires and all that kind of stuff here in a few minutes. But I showed you my little basic array.
Actually, that was over 2 years ago, I believe.
Was it 2 freaking years ago?
That I first saw that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. That's what having a kid does to you. And I know you know this, is that time just like flies by. 2 years seems like last.
Yeah, to put that in perspective, I don't think you had a kid yet. I think your wife was still pregnant.
Yeah. You met Jack and you met Sassy. Jack, by the way, is, well, I would give somebody $100 to take him away, because I know that 2 days later they would offer $200 for me to take him back. He's not a good kitty. But anyways, I showed you, we still love him. I showed you the solar panel array, and what I was getting at is, at first, I'm going to put you on the coals here a little bit. You said, it didn't impress me that much at first. But what took hold since then to get you interested in solar power?
So it was kind of a long road to get to where I'm at today, which I think about solar power all the time now. But the event, of course, was the big Texas freeze we had, which was pushing 2 years ago at this point. Mm-hmm. So not long after I came and visited you that time. And, I lost power here for 3 days, as did much of the state. And we had to evacuate. Subsequently, our house flooded due to a burst pipe because nobody was here to notice it was, burst, which caused me to have to move out of my house for 3-4 months while it was reconstructed, and just really turned my life upside down. And I was just, I'd spent a lot of time thinking about what could I have done to have some electricity during that time. And then I remembered, hey, Johnny had this set up. And so I started investigating creating something like that for myself so that I would have at least a minimal amount of power. And then, of course, I did a whole video about that on my channel. So a lot of people have seen that already. And but it's kind of become addictive get this free power coming in every day now. And I know some people will argue with the term free because I did pay for the equipment, but equipment's paid for. So anything it produces from this point is free. And, and now I'm like, dang, I'd kind of like to have some more of this free power. And so anyway,
like
it takes you down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And, so we've got a number of things to talk about there.
Yep. So we have a little Google Docs. I like letting people behind the scenes a little bit when it's fast, interesting to do so. We had a little Google Doc set up here about kind of topics we want to get to, because there's so much down that rabbit hole of solar that I think some people don't really realize. They might see B-roll clips or news clips or whatever of like solar farms and solar panels, and like they might take a walk through their neighborhood and see big solar installations on their neighbors' houses and things like that. But I don't think a whole lot of people, and I don't blame them, because there's plenty of aspects of society and of science and of life that I don't think much more about, because I'm not an expert in there, and it hasn't piqued my geek interest yet. But there's so much more to just those glass, black or blue or whatever color glass panels that people have on their roof. And for a lot of people, I would wager, honestly, that for most people who have the whole home installation where they have 10, 15, 20, 30, whatever kilowatt production on their roof, that most of those people were looking just for a turnkey solution, that they themselves don't necessarily, nor are they necessarily required to, have an intimate knowledge of the photovoltaic conversion of sunlight to electricity. And I'm not going to get into that here either. But my point is, they don't have an intimate understanding of it. They just wanted to not pay, an electrical bill anymore, or at least convert their electric bill payment into something that either they had a passing interest in renewable energy, maybe they had quote unquote green aspirations, whatever the reasoning is, they wanted the solar panels, and they didn't necessarily need a whole lot of background. So what we're going to talk about here, and we're going to pull from the Doodle Docs, the Google Docs to keep us on track here, is just kind of starting from the beginning. So basically, to use an example where I showed David my setup and something caught him, the spark that what he just mentioned that got him into it was not being, if I can say this, caught with your pants down during the next emergency, to have some sort of capacity to generate your own electricity and generate your own power. Not necessarily power your whole house, not a whole thing, but just like have some backup to assist with gas generators or to offset gas generators, to supplement whatever. And kind of how that all starts. So I'm going to read this first line on the Google Doc that David wrote that's so beautiful. He says, some people grow their own food, some people make their own clothes, and some people like to make their own electricity. Solar is the most economical and most available way to do that, unquote. And that's a perfect lead-in to how we're going to discuss all this. So I guess the best place to start is with the first kind of bullet point here. And we're going to talk about the typical residential solar setup. So not a giant solar farm producing 1,000 megawatts of electricity to feed Pflugerville or whatever. We're going to talk about a local home residential setup. And I'll kind of let you start on this, because I think while I set up an array, and I've shown my listeners and YouTube viewers what I've got in typical 8-bit guy fashion, you have done way better in just kind of polishing it up and like kind of materials used and applications that you're using it for. So why is it that a commercial setup is a no-brainer to operate?
Well, much like you said earlier, it's a turnkey thing. You pay some installer to come in, they install it, and then you pretty much never touch it again. It just works. And so for the average consumer that doesn't want to know the intimate details of how it works, and they don't want to have to worry about turning things on and turning things off and rationing power here and there and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's a solution where they basically just they sign a contract, someone comes out, they put it on their house, and it just works behind the scenes, and they don't have to deal with it. And I understand the appeal to that. And I wouldn't criticize anybody for going with such a solution. But right. Yeah, I wanted to talk about some of the turnoffs for me as kind of a nerd, and also someone looking to, I have ulterior motives for my solar setup compared to the normal person who just wants to save money on their electric bill. And so
Mhm.
I wanted to go over some of the reasons that I don't like, for me, the typical commercialized residential setup.
Okay.
So one of the things, and I know I'm going to get some backlash for saying this, but a
No.
lot of the solar companies are scam artists.
Absolutely.
I
I
know.
100% agree. I don't mean to cut you off, but yeah, I think a lot of people would kind of agree with that there's a lot of fly by night stuff and a lot of scams. So I 100%
Well, and I
agree with
wouldn't even
that.
necessarily say fly by night. I would say some very established companies. And the reason I say this is because I've had a number of them over the last 5 or 6 years come out to my house and give me their sales pitch.
Hmm.
And, I've had a number of companies try to give me, hour-long sales pitches, whether it be, people trying to sell you, what do you call that? Those vacation properties,
Timeshares. Yeah.
shares and stuff like that. And they got an hour-long sales pitch where they try to build up this, to try to make you think that it's a wise choice for your money. And
Mhm.
then, of course, I've had people come out and try to sell me like this, lifetime paint on my house. It's not really paint. It's like some of the kind of texture that they put on your
Epoxy or
house
something. Yeah.
that supposedly lasts the life of your house, but it costs like 40 grand. I think that's what we were quoted to have it done. And I'm like, I can get a regular home paint job for like 3 grand, and how many paint jobs can I afford for, the price of that they wanted. Anyway, point is
Mhm.
they give, an hour long high pressure sales pitch. Same thing when you go to like a car dealership or whatever, you get, high pressure sales. And that is what I experienced. I've had 3 different solar companies come out and pitch their solar systems to me. And each one was an hour long high pressure sales um, session.
Mhm.
And one of, as they're talking, my mind is constantly turning, like thinking, what are they not telling me here?
Right.
What are they trying to, you know, I really analyze what people are trying to do. And I know these people are trained. They've gone to training classes to teach them how to sell you this stuff. And one of the things they, of course, they want to know your electric bill. They want to see what your electric payment is. And one of the things it reminds me of is when you go to a car dealer, if anybody knows how car dealers work, they always want to ask you, what would you like your payment to be?
Yeah.
And there's
Dollar.
reason that they ask that, of course, and it's to take advantage of you. And it's kind of similar because what these solar companies are going to do is they're going to try to figure out what your electric bill is. And all they have to do is get you a payment for their electric bill that or for their solar setup that's about $20 a month less than your electric bill, and they feel like they've got you sold.
Mhm.
And what they're not telling you is the huge profit margin that they have in there on that. And that's what bothers me about now I know that there's probably some really honest solar companies out there, but I hadn't found one yet.
Mhm. And I would say, if you're an honest solar retailer, reach out to us, but you just get 1,000 of the same. And again, it's not to denigrate. I feel bad for the reputable solar companies that are genuine and are legitimate, that unfortunately, because there's a lot of this in real estate too, your phone gets blown up with all the, are you selling your property?
Yeah.
Like, those are just, I call them vultures. And there's a lot of vultures in solar installation as well. So it's something good to look out for. And I just the whole point of that is I feel bad for the legit ones. It's hard to know what the legit ones are, and I certainly don't have a recommendation right here on the radio or on the podcast of a reputable solar
Yeah.
company. The best bet, the best thing I can offer up, and maybe you'll agree with this or not, or have some input on this, is to find a, if you see a neighbor with a solar installation, maybe just ask them, who did you use and did you like them? And maybe ask, a handful of neighbors, maybe across different neighborhoods, maybe 4 or 5, get a good sample pool of customers who've had this installation done in the companies, and basically go after you have 5 or 6 or 7 kind of examples, like, okay, I feel pretty comfortable about this company because I know somebody who's used them and whatever, get some good word of mouth. But yeah, I don't know who the reputable ones are, and that's all. Do you want to talk about, do you want to finish that point? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, it doesn't really matter, even if they were reputable, because the other 2 points that I was going to make kind of nullify the whole thing for me. And again, this is for me and what my needs and my tastes are.
The disclaimer.
So,
Yeah.
First of all, the thing that a lot of people were surprised about, and I was even surprised about this when I started researching solar systems, several years ago, is the vast majority of them do not work during a power outage.
Mm-hmm.
And they are required by law to shut off the inverters if the mains power is out. And there's various reasons for that we probably don't need. Some of it's pretty obvious, like you don't want to be pumping power back on the power lines
Mm-hmm.
while the guys are out there trying to work on the power lines and stuff like that. But one of the things that means is they do require that you have this big shut-off switch on the side of your house that for some reason, if it doesn't automatically go off, the lineman can track it down and go out there. Just all they got to do is walk up to the side of your house, pull the big lever, and it shuts it off.
Right.
And you have to have a lot of permitting and some very expensive equipment to do this grid connection and stuff because of that sort of thing. Now I know, and there's going to be some people, running to their keyboards or shouting, that whatever, that there are systems that do work during a power outage, but, and I've seen some actually, but they're rare. I mean, I know like 10 people that have solar on their home and only one of theirs will work during a power outage. And even that guy, his house still shuts off, but he has 4 plugs on his inverter that he can walk up to with extension cords and plug things into them
Mm-hmm.
and power like your refrigerator or window unit air conditioner or something like that to have some power when the power is out. But he doesn't have any batteries. So as soon as the sun goes down, it still doesn't work. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
being that my whole motivation for setting up my system was backup power, the traditional solar system is rather useless for that.
Right.
So the other thing that I wanted to mention is like the way these systems work is let's just use some round numbers. Let's say your house uses 100 kilowatt hours during the day or during a 24-hour period. It's just a nice round number. Well, obviously, your solar system can only produce power when the sun's out. So what these solar companies will do is they'll come out and they'll say, well, okay, we need to generate at least 100 or more kilowatt hours during the day while the sun is out, even if you don't need that much. And we're going to pump the excess into the grid.
Mm-hmm.
That way you get credit for it so that at night you can pull power back from the grid and you don't have to pay for it. That way your electricity is free. So basically they have way more panels on your house than you really need to power your house. Right. So let's say that on average, your house pulls 4 kilowatts. Then, sorry, you may want to cut that out.
It's all right.
So let's say on average, your house pulls 4 kilowatts. They're going to want to put 10 kilowatts of panels on your house so that they can be feeding back into the grid, a lot of power during the day. Right. So now, if you think about that, what if every house was like that? If every single house had a grid-tied solar system like this, what problem you would have? You would have this huge glut of power during the day, and there would be no power during the evening, because the only reason this works is because only some people have solar and most people don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you're still reliant on the regular grid. But if everybody had solar, it just wouldn't work. It wouldn't work this way because there would have to be somewhere for the power to go.
Right. Storage.
And be stored.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So anyway, those are the reasons that I don't like traditional solar setups.
So there's a little side tangent to that. When you mentioned the reason why residential solar installations work is because not everybody has it. Because if everybody had it, there would be a glut of extra power and there's nowhere to store it. So my little side tangent is I am also, and this is through my fascination that budded, over a decade ago with solar technology. One of the constant things that comes across my feed, articles that come across my feed when I'm laying there in bed and reading things, is all the different, very fascinating ways they're trying to not combat, but take on that challenge of energy storage. One of the ways is, hydro storage, like a hydro battery, where they use a pump to basically pump a whole bunch of water up on top of a dam. Europe does a lot of this, where they use pumps to pump during the day with the excess power, get the water up into the reservoir, and then at night they open the gates and they turns the turbines, and then the process just repeats every single day. So the extra power is generated. You can use it at night. Another technology that's very new right now that they're doing research on is using sand, basically up to and including melting sand, using the excess electrical heat to melt the sand and then drawing upon that heat to do turbines and stuff at night. Not to get too sidetracked by this, but heat exchange kind of conversion to electricity isn't super duper efficient. The best way that we know of right now, or like kind of that I've personally researched, is the hydro approach, where you basically fill a reservoir at night. Another super interesting way of energy storage to potentially store this glut, if it ever occurs, is gravity batteries, where they basically use the excess power generation to hoist a big concrete block that weighs hundreds and hundreds of tons, like the weight of an aircraft carrier, up into the air. And the whole idea behind these is they would install them in existing like mine shafts, so there's not a whole bunch of outlay of infrastructure and cost. And so during the day, you're generating electricity with solar, with wind, with geothermal, whatever, and the access is hoisting this big old weight up into the sky. And then at night, when you're not generating any more solar electricity, at least, they change direction. They let the gravity pull the thing back down, and through a bunch of gear reduction and things like that, it generates so many megawatts. So there are active technologies
there's also flywheels.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Tesla, for example, and some other companies are also working on just battery storage. So, yeah, there's different ways in the works to store it, but none of them are very mature technologies at this point. Well, I mean, I say mature. The pumped hydro thing you discussed has been around for decades, but it's still an expensive proposition and whatnot. But anyway, yeah, each one of them has their pros and cons. But bottom line is, the way things are right now, not everybody can have solar, because once we reach a certain point where enough people have it, then we would have exactly the problem we just described. There would be all this extra power in the day and nowhere to store it. And then at night, people would have blackouts because there's not enough power generation at night to handle it. So anyway,
and I would hope, and we'll move on to the next thing, but I would hope, and I can only speak locally because you're up near Dallas and I'm down near Houston. We are both in Texas, that as this technology advances and progresses and is implemented, that at least in Texas, the management and oversight of that infrastructure build is handled better. I mentioned to listeners, and David, obviously you went over this. Your viewers and subscribers all know this, that anytime there's a weather event in Texas, like a major weather event, and I don't mean hurricanes for me down here in Houston, but like if it's too hot or if it's too cold, we get messages and alerts on our phone from ERCOT, who oversees the whole electrical grid. Please conserve energy today. Please don't do laundry. Please don't run your dishwasher. Please, set your air conditioning higher because it's 106 degrees outside Fahrenheit, 41 Celsius for my international listeners. Please conserve. And then in the wintertime, it's too cold. Don't run your heaters. And please, it's like a disaster. I hope I'm not offending anyone saying this. It sounds like third world type stuff, especially when you're talking about a state that is supposedly the energy capital of the entire world. It's an embarrassment that we can't basically have all our stuff running full blast, no matter the temperature outside. That's for a lot of political reasons and stuff that I won't get into. But I just hope that as this technology progresses, as more solar is added, and we get to this theoretical part where consumers are more energy independent and we are the ones feeding the grid, that they have these energy storage systems figured out better in Texas, and that we hopefully change it. But the hope is that there's so much time between now and then, theoretically, that you hope something would change with the infrastructure. But that's a really good point to jump off to the next thing, is the DIY setups. We talk a lot about, in this country especially, how energy independence, that's a huge political topic. I'm not sure how divisive it is, but I guess it could be divisive, to where we talk about as a country that we don't want to be so dependent on foreign oil, and it's been a big discussion with Russia invading Ukraine. Again, not going into any details, but you don't want to be as a country, you don't want to be, theoretically and speaking, is you don't want to be at somebody else's mercy for power. Where it changes in my mind and my thinking, and I'm sure your thinking too, to a degree, if not the same, is that why do we have to wait on local government or whatever to solve our energy independence problems? Energy independence can start with me, and it can start with you figuring out ways to be energy independent. And what I've come up with is, because people always say, well, for energy backup, just get gas generators, or just have a natural gas generator plugged into the natural gas pipelines, have something, fossil fuel based, which obviously, yes, it's a good idea to have a gas generator as backup. It's a good idea to have diesel generators. It's a good idea to have natural gas, everything. But all of that is still suckling on the teat of somebody else to supply you with gasoline, to supply you with natural gas, and to supply you with diesel. In the case of natural gas, since a lot of Texas energy infrastructure is based on burning natural gas and the supply of natural gas, that natural gas generator is not any good if all the pipelines are frozen and they can't get the fuel to your generator.
So I'd like to point out, sorry to interrupt, but I'd like to point out that during our big 3-day freeze that we had nearly 2 years ago, that gasoline was difficult to find. Most of the gas stations were shut down because either they didn't have power or they didn't have gas, or both.
Right.
And there were some gas stations in town that were working, but there was a line. You had to wait like an hour or two in line to get some gas. You could not get propane. You could not get natural gas. A lot of the people's natural gas supplies to their home was not working. So, and this was just a freeze. I mean, imagine a more like an earthquake or some other kind of much worse natural catastrophe. Like you say, fossil fuels are not always going to be available when the supply chain is disrupted.
Right. So that's what I'm saying, is that's how I've come to the conclusion. And I don't want to speak for you, but we've come to this realization that solar energy and renewable isn't a political talking point. If we're talking about energy independence, then it's a lot easier to produce electrons ourselves than it is to refine petroleum. So that is why and I don't mean to speak for you, but that we come to this conclusion that, yes, in addition to having gas and all that kind of traditional stuff, I want a means of being able to produce my own power. And solar is arguably one of the best ways to do that on an individual level. You could supplement it with wind also for at nighttime. You can supplement it with, I was going to say geothermal, but that's not really the case. I don't think you can get a permit to dig 2 miles down into the crust. But yeah, energy independence, and one of the easiest ways to have energy independence is with solar. And if you're like a geek like me and David are, you might have at least a plug-in hybrid, if not an EV, and being able to produce your own electricity can provide life-saving miles. You're not going to be on a typical DIY setup. Maybe you're not going to be charging at 7.7 kilowatts all the time, but you can trickle charge a little bit, and sometimes 2 or 3 miles a day can be the difference between life and death. And you could theoretically you could take your mobile rig in the car with you and go out somewhere with a tent and kind of wait out the zombie apocalypse while generating your own electricity. So I was being extreme there. Let's talk about, kind of on that vein of individual energy independence, how people can start to set up their own, and kind of like wattages and panel types, and we'll get into the components and kind of theory of it all now. So let's talk about your setup first, I guess.
Yeah. So I know that your setup is made from a number of individual components. Like you've got a charge controller made by some manufacturer, and you've got, panels by a different manufacturer, and you've got a battery from a different manufacturer, and an inverter from a different manufacturer, and all this. And you can build your own setup, but I never found that particularly appealing. myself for various reasons. And I was attracted to these all-in-one setups that are coming out now. These all-in-one setups emerged like, I don't know, like 10 years ago or something, with like the little Jackeries and Bluetti and whatnot, when they were just little systems for camping and stuff like that. But they've grown. They've grown. Every year they come out with more and more powerful systems. And so that's what I got a year and a half ago, was a Bluetti. And it's basically an all-in-one unit with a handle on it you can carry. And it's got the batteries in it. It's got the charge controller and the inverter all built into one unit. And a nice little colorful graphical LCD screen telling you all the information about where the power is coming from and going and whatnot. And then it came with some portable panels that you can just, stick out wherever. They're kind of good for camping or whatever. And I played around with those a bit. And, but eventually I was like, I really need a way to permanently mount these. So I bought some residential solar panels from a guy not too far from here that sells them for like $60 a panel. And these panels are like, they're supposed to be like 230 watts each, but they are used. And, those ratings that they give are, of course, best case scenarios, like in a lab where they have just the right lighting and just the right temperature and all this kind of stuff. So you're never going to see the number that they give you there. So, in fact, I've determined that generally I'm producing, those panels produce about 75% of what, realistically speaking, they produce about 75% of the rating.
Right.
So, I have, for example, it's close to 1,000 watts of rated power with the 4 panels I get or have. But realistically, when the sun's out full blast, I get 720 watts. That's what I get. And, anyway, so actually, I'm in the process of upgrading, which we'll talk about that later. But this is the system I've been using for a year and a half, and and it's 720 watts doesn't seem like a lot of power to some people, because it really just depends on what it is that you're trying to power. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about how the average person has no idea how much power different appliances take. And I want to give a few little fun anecdotes to that. Sure. When I used to work at my last job doing IT work, a lot of times I'd get a call in the morning, somebody say, "Oh, my computer's not working." And so I'd go to their cubicle and, I'd say, "Oh yeah, the battery backup is, we have the little APC battery backups under the desk." And I'm going to make a long story short. What tended to happen is the two things would happen. One thing is the janitors would come in at night and they would plug their vacuum cleaners into the UPS because they were just looking for a power outlet. And of course it would trip them because the vacuum cleaner pulls 12 amps, 13 amps, something like that. And those little battery backups are not designed to be able to handle that much. And so it would trip the little breaker and it would shut their computer off, and they'd come in the next day and that would be the problem. The other problem, though, and this is probably more common, is we had probably 50 people in the office who kept little space heaters under their desk. And they would plug them in to the UPS because they're just looking for a power outlet, right? And they just plug it in, and it would cause the UPS to trip. And when I would tell them, "You can't plug this in to the UPS," I cannot tell you how many times I heard them say, "But it's just a little space heater. It doesn't use much power." And they don't realize that space heater uses more power than everything in their entire cubicle combined. Because they don't understand, watts, amps, resistive heat loads, things like that. And likewise, I got when I released the video for my solar setup, there was a guy, there was 2 or 3 people that commented in the comments that it's a pathetic amount of power. You can't even run a hairdryer with it. And the thing about it is, a hairdryer is probably one of the most power hungry devices you can plug into any outlet in your home. I mean, it pulls the maximum amount of power that the outlet is even rated to carry without melting the outlet, So that they were wrong on 2 counts. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
So they're wrong on 2 counts. First of all, the hairdryer is not a power, what's the
Low
word?
draw.
Right.
Right.
It is not a minuscule amount of power to power a hairdryer. The second
Like
thing they don't
1600
understand,
watts. Yeah.
the second thing they didn't understand is I can run a hairdryer. I could totally plug a hairdryer into my solar system and run it. The catch is I couldn't run it indefinitely because you have the battery there to buffer. And how long does someone use a hairdryer?
Right. Exactly.
They're only going to use it a few minutes. So if you only wanted to use it for 5 minutes, it's no problem. You could totally use it. Same with a microwave oven.
Yep.
It pulls way more power than my panels can generate, but you're only going to run it for 2 or 3 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's going to pull from the battery, and then the battery is going to charge back up, with excess solar when you're done. So you can run these heavy loads for short bursts of time.
Right. The normal usage time. So you're running 1,000-watt microwave for, a minute here and there to heat up a hot pocket is totally fine because, a couple minutes after the microwave stops, if you're in full sunlight, the battery's at 100% again. So this idea that you can't run large loads, you can run very large loads. I've got my 780-watt panels right now, heat of summer in Texas, 106 degrees Fahrenheit outside, which heat is a huge degradation to the efficiency of solar panels. I think I generate maximum around 600 watts out of the 780. That's just on average because I don't go, aiming at the sun every day, but I generate about 3 kilowatts a day where I'm sitting between the shadows of the houses. Anyways, I have a little analogy I've been using lately, which I think helps some people. And
imagine you have a cup that you're drinking from with a straw. And imagine there's another straw that goes into the cup that's just trickling in a little bit of fluid or water, whatever you're drinking, a little bit at a time. But you're not sitting there drinking the straw the whole time. You go over there every minute or two and you take a sip and the water level goes down, but then it starts rising again because you've got this constant small trickle of water going back in there.
Exactly.
So anyway, that's how your battery works. You're taking that steady solar energy and you're buffering it.
Right.
Yeah.
So we can talk about some component. Well, I'll talk about my components just briefly. It's a solar panel, 780 watt theoretical top output. I have got up to 700, like in springtime, and I'm angled just right, and it's 72 degrees outside. It's basically lab conditions. I can approach the rated output, but I have those going into my charge controller. Just for geeky technicals, it's a 60 amp charge controller, which means I can charge up to 60 amps and I think like 1250 watts maximum. So I'm not even approaching the max in 100 volts. So I'm not even approaching the maximum capacity of my charge controller. That is going to charge a lithium iron phosphate battery, a 200 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery with a nominal voltage of 12.8 volts. Connected to that battery is my inverter, which is it's a pure sine wave inverter. We can talk about that in a minute and why pure sine wave versus rectified is important. But it's a 2,000 watt pure sine wave inverter with a peak 4,000 watt. And peak wattage is what we'll talk about also in a minute. And that goes out to, feed all my 120 volt access. I'm recording right now. Everything I'm doing right now is running off of my solar setup. It's going out the inverter to my computer here, to my giant 4K 55-inch monitor that's blasting my face with the light of 1,000 suns, powering the camera here, powering my high-end boutique, mic preamp and everything like that. I'm running off solar right now, and it's kind of overcast right now, so I'm kind of taken out of the battery. But anyways, that's all the basic setups, the basic elements of my solar system and every solar system. David's is more all-in-one because he has the Bluetti that has the inverter and charge controller and like inputs for the solar all built into it, which is a wonderful, wonderful way to go. I want to talk about just for a minute, one of the most important pieces of being able to, great, you have solar panels and you're charging. How do you use the energy? You need what's called an inverter. It's the same thing that you plug into your car cigarette lighter to charge your laptop on the road or charge your tablet or whatever. Back in the day, before all the cars had USB ports and things like that, you used to have to plug in an inverter to the cigarette outlet or clamp one onto your car battery, your 12 volt car battery to do, draw bigger loads with. So an inverter is is where the rubber meets the road as far as using the electricity. And where I'm going at with this, there's two things: pure sine wave versus rectified, and then the peak surge output rating. So 2,000 watt continuous, 4,000 watt peak. First, I'll talk about the pure sine wave versus rectified. Pure sine wave is going to be a little more expensive, but that's what's coming out of your walls already at home. Is a theoretically nice. There's some noise and distortion in it, but a nice curvy up and down in United States, 60 hertz, 120 volt sine wave, or it could be 60 hertz, 240 volts, 250, whatever your circuit is for. But that's what all your electronics are looking for, and what treats your electronics most nicely. It doesn't matter so much for charging a phone, but it does matter for inductive loads like motors, AC motors and things like that. So your window air conditioners, your refrigerators, and different things like that have this huge surge load when you first start it up. So your refrigerator, well, I'll use a better example. Your air conditioner, typical 500 watt, 5,000 BTU window air conditioner, will run typically, it's around 500 watts, 5,000 BTUs, theoretically around 500 watts for just a basic like high-end air conditioner. So it'll run continuously at 500 watts. But when it first kicks on, when that motor first kicks on, it is drawing thousands of watts for a split second to kick that motor into gear. Imagine it like pushing a car. When you start an electrical motor, it's like having a 5,000 pound SUV sitting there, and then you take a 100-yard sprint up to it and just shoulder into the trunk. That's what an inductive load is like, versus kind of starting slow and pushing. That's where the inverter, AC inverter technology kind of comes into. But anyways, that huge massive load to start something, that's that peak wattage, and that's why the peak surge wattage of inverters is important. And then the pure sine wave aspect of it is that your electrical motor, it'll cause excess heat and resistance and all sort of bad things for that electric motor to be running on a square wave. You'll hear it. You'll hear the AC compressor, or you'll hear your refrigerator, or you'll hear an electric fan going as it's running on a rectified wave inverter using square waves. It's not good. So splurge for the pure sine wave, and make sure that the peak wattage output is within the envelope of what your load is. So a refrigerator may be running at 90 watts, 100 watts, something. I put a kilowatt on there to see, but it's not really that much to run a refrigerator. When it's running, it's like a light bulb. But kicking on the compressor in the refrigerator and all the little fans and things, that's a huge surge load for a very split second. So that's the inverter kind of covered. What I want to talk about now is, and David kind of covered that, you can have, let's say, a 500 watt. I'm looking back at the notes here. You can have like a 500 watt solar array. And then if someone says you can't run a hairdryer, yes, you can. It's going to be recuperating at 500 watts. So you can pull 1,600 watts while you do your hair, and then the water pours back into the cup when you're not using it, because it's off 99.9% of the time. So that's kind of what I want to talk about, is what you can do with wattage and kind of let's talk about like a typical DIY setup a little bit more, and kind of different things to consider. Talk about your solar installation a little bit from your panel wiring and things.
I think it's important to talk about cost, right? Yeah. My system is what I would call an entry level. And again, I mentioned earlier, it produces about 720 watts of solar. Mm-hmm. And the actual machine, the Bluetti unit, has a surge power of, I think, like 3,000 or 4,000 watts that it could do very, very briefly for a split second. So you can run just about anything on it for a limited amount of time. Right. But it only has 2 kilowatt hours of battery. And what that means is, what you're really looking at is, okay, when the power goes down, how long is that going to keep you running until the next day when the sun comes back out? And so you have to kind of do the math, and you have to say, well, okay, the sun's going to be down for 12 hours. And if you divide it out, I'd have to pull the calculator out, but I think it's like 200 or 300 watts per or watt hours. Sorry. Yeah. 200 or 300 watt hours per or watts per hour, whatever, how you want to look at that.
Right.
But basically you would need to keep your usage down to about 200 or 300 watts
budget
throughout the night and budget your power in order to be able to make it to the next day, which that's actually one of the reasons I'm actually about to add some storage to mine, some bigger batteries, because I am concerned that in a massive power outage that I might not do too well. Now, I did an experiment where I've got the little window unit air conditioner, which, to be fair, I have a super, super efficient window unit air conditioner. It's the most efficient one, at least at the time, that you could get. And so it will run off 200 watts on low power. So I actually did a test where I did run that all night on 200 watts. The only thing that test didn't take into account, though, is like, what if the power were actually out and all the rest of the house was 100 degrees? How well could I keep that one room? How well could I keep the one room cooled at night with only 200 watts? And I don't know. I think it would be tolerable, livable, but it might not be super comfortable. So anyway, that's why I'm adding some more batteries. But anyway, so that's one of the things you have to keep in mind. But again, my system, I spent about $3,000 total on the panels and the Bluetti unit and the air conditioner.
Right.
And so that, obviously, and I guess this goes without saying, but you can't run your central AC on a system like this. It requires far too much power. Mm-hmm. So you have to have some auxiliary means. You have to be able to decide, okay, what am I going to run on a little $3,000 solar setup? And so some of the things that you can run would be a very small space heater. And, especially, any space heater, as long as it has a low setting. Mm-hmm. And you might want to actually check and see, like, what is the advertised watt draw on low. I have some space heaters that use as little as 200 watts. And then I have got a big one that has a low setting that's 600 watts on low. So I can run that, especially during the day. And I did during last winter. I ran it every day, all day long, 600 watts on low, pulling from my solar. LED lights these days are super efficient. You can run a lot of lighting and it won't even hardly tip the scale, so to speak, on your solar. I mean, I could probably run every light in my house and it probably wouldn't be more than 100 or 150 watts total. So again, this is a drop in the bucket. And just to keep a few rooms going, we're talking like, I've already measured it. We're talking like 40 watts, I think, just to keep all the lights on in like 3 or 4 different rooms, so that's no problem. Computers, they use, well, except for Johnny's, most computers only use like 200 watts.
I'm using my laptop right now. I'm not using my big old beast mode RTX 3090 rig, but yeah, you're right. Yep.
So there's a lot of stuff that you can run. You can keep your cell phones charged, and so there's a lot of things you can run. You can keep a refrigerator going. Like I said, you can temporarily use some high power things like microwaves and blow dryers, but you wouldn't be able to keep them running constantly. Yeah. So that's kind of what you get in that price range. And the other thing is, and this is a point I made in my video, is that if you have a setup like that, there's no reason not to run it every day. And that's kind of what I bought it as a backup system, but then I was like, well, I keep this thing running every day. So like right now, as we speak, it's in the other room, but my little window unit AC is running full blast, cooling my house down because it's like over 100 degrees outside today. Mm-hmm. And so that power is going to help cool the house, and it's independent from my regular air conditioner. So that's I don't have a good way to calculate how much money it's saving me, but it is reducing the load on my air conditioner.
Right. And it's supplementing.
So you can use these backup systems every day and they will pay for themselves in time. I mean, the payback period could be 5, maybe as much as 10 years. But yeah.
So there's an interesting point to that I want to make. If you're using it every day, and I'm using mine every day also. Typically, if you haven't looked at solar deep cycle storage recently, in the past it's been lead acid batteries. deep cycle lead acid batteries that you'd use for trolling motors and on boats and things like that. Typical off grid kind of setups. The technology has improved, and yes, they are more expensive. But lithium based batteries, right now it's lithium iron phosphate. They are rated, if you are careful and you're mindful about your top charge and your lowest level discharge and things like that, they're rated for thousands of cycles, whereas typical lead acid batteries are rated for, if you got 200 cycles out of it, like full discharge, cycles. And with deep cycle lead acid, a full discharge is considered 50%. So if you got a 200 amp hour lead acid battery, you can only really use 100 amp hours out of that before you start damaging the battery. With lithium iron phosphate, a low discharge is, I keep it safely at like 10%. They say you could go down to 0% and recharge just fine. But if you keep it within this window, the window I keep it within is like 10% discharge, and then I keep it like 98% top charge. And if you keep it in that really nice window, which in a 200 amp hour lithium battery is probably like 180 amps worth of storage that you can fully use, the battery will last thousands of cycles, and that is up to and over a decade of use if you were using it every day. But the thing is, with a solar setup, you are not discharging it to 0% every day. You're only skimming off the top all day long. So it's really at night, if you kind of in an emergency situation where you're really going to kind of chew into it, versus when in my typical use case scenario at night, when I've got the laptop running and different things running, I can go all night long, baby, and maybe go down to like 50% discharge. The point is, you keep it within parameters, a nice safe envelope with the lithium iron phosphate, and the batteries will last for 10 years. And the only reason I address that, and we'll move on to different things, is when you say use it every day to offset costs, people might be like, well, lithium iron phosphate batteries are expensive, and you might have to, you're just never going to catch up to offsetting cost if you're constantly changing lithium iron phosphate.
So I wanted to address that too, because that was one of the most common comments I got on my video that I released on the topic. People were asking, well, aren't you going to ruin those batteries cycling them every night? And and I didn't make this clear in the video that I did, but yeah, I only run my system during the day. Right. Mm-hmm. When the sun goes down, usually around 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, I go over and I turn the air conditioner off, or if it's the wintertime, I turn the heater off, whatever I'm drawing power from.
Right.
And then I turn the inverter off on the Bluetti unit. And so the battery is still at like 95% or something like that when I go to bed. And I do that for a number of reasons. It's not so much to protect the battery as it is the fact that this whole thing was meant as a backup solution. Mm-hmm. So when the sun goes down, I want to make sure that battery's full so that if the power goes off at, say, 10 o'clock at night, guess what? I got a full battery. I can go start drawing from if I need. And so, so I'm not cycling the batteries every night. I do about once a month. So, I've done this maybe a dozen times since I've installed the system. I do let it run down overnight because I want to make sure that everything's still working and the batteries still have good capacity, and it's probably good to cycle them every now and then. So I do a full night test every now and then, but I don't want to do it on a regular basis because I want that for emergency. That's so. But yeah, during the day, there's no reason to have those solar panels just sitting there not doing anything.
Right.
So you might as well put them to work.
Exactly. So let's move on to some of the more realities of it, depending on how you set up your panels. And like, let's talk about HOA and city codes like that. I can only speak for myself in terms of HOA, at least, and that for most of my stuff, it's a ask forgiveness later thing, because doggone it, I'm a Texan. This is my property. I'll do what I want on my property within reason. I'm not going to put up a 200-foot ham radio mast in my front yard and just, well, it's my property. I can do what I want. No, but things like I replaced my fence, a year ago with a new fence, and HOA is like, you need to get permits for us to do that. I was like, I just increased the property value of our street. Like you can, whatever, I don't care. I'm going to fix my fence. It's a danger. It's a hazard. I'm not going to wait for your approval while my son is crawling through the gaps in the fence, or a dog gets in the fence, a Rottweiler or something like that. So I'm going to fix the fence and y'all can deal with it later. I did the drone shot before and after. I sent them all the plans like afterward, but like, anybody listening to this dealing with a homeowners association knows exactly what I'm talking about right now. So in terms of my solar panels, I have them up on my patio roof. You can see in other videos. If I put this on YouTube, I'll splice the B-roll in, where you cannot see them from the streets. That is my personal setup. Is the HOA? It can't hurt the HOA if the HOA can't see it, kind of thing. Now, if you're talking about putting panels, and I'll leave this to you because you have more experience with this right now because you have panels on your roof, talk about some of the issues to think about when putting panels up on your roof or in a more kind of visible or risky situation.
So I hired a professional solar installer. He's kind of like a subcontractor, and I just said, hey, I got these 4 panels. Will you mount them on my roof? So he did it. And he used the exact same equipment and mounting brackets and everything that one of the professional solar installation companies would use. And he followed all the general guidelines of making sure there's so many inches of space between the edge of the roof and the panels for firemen to go around, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But I only have 4 panels, right? And my panels are on kind of the back of my house where because I wanted them facing south, so that worked out fine. But you really can't see them from the street. I mean, you can if you go all the way down to I live on a dead end street, and you have to go all the way down to the dead end, and then you kind of have to look back, and you can just barely see the edge of the panels. So like the city inspector, if he were driving down the street, he's not ever going to see them. But the funny thing is, when I did this, I didn't even give any consideration to permits. And my thinking was, oh, well, hey, I'm not tying this into my grid, right? It's not tied into to my electrical system in my house, so right. I shouldn't need a permit. But some people brought up in the comments on the video that the city might have still required a permit just for the mounting of the panels on the home, which I never considered. So I started researching that recently because I've been wanting to add some more panels, which we'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, and I've realized that, oh, you know what? I probably was supposed to get a permit to put those up there. And so now I'm kind of faced with the situation of, well, gee, I want to go down and apply for a permit to put new panels on my house because I really want to put some on the front of my house to catch the western sun as the sun goes down, because that will widen my window of solar production. Because right now I start losing power around 7 o'clock. It starts to tip off around 7 o'clock, and you can see it clearly going down for the next 2 hours until the sun sets at 9 o'clock. And but if I had some west facing panels, I could have more or less full power from those panels all the way up to probably like 8:30, 8:45, something like that in the evening. And every bit you can widen the window is good, because that means less you would need to store for battery power and stuff like that,
right,
for a backup solution. But anyway, so I'm like, well, crap, if I need to go down to the city and apply for a permit for these front panels, they might find out I have these panels already on the other side of my house, and they might find me or make me take them down, or I don't know. So that's a consideration that I guess maybe I overlooked at the time, but it's something to warn you about. Now, if you live out in the county, like or out in the rural area, you won't have to worry about this kind of thing. But I live in an urban, or suburban neighborhood that's governed by these city codes and stuff like that. However, I have been researching. There's different things that you can do, though. For example, in some jurisdictions, you can mount them on the ground. And you wouldn't need a permit for that. I mean, it depends on where you live, but in many cases you can mount them on the ground, which actually I would prefer if I had enough property space that wasn't shaded. I would actually prefer to have ground mounted solar arrays, because then you could clean them and get snow off them or whatever very easily without having to worry about climbing up on the roof or anything, which I'm not going to do. So that's an option. I've even seen some YouTube videos where people built solar trailers. You basically take a trailer and
Yep.
you can mount some panels on it. You can mount like 2,000-3,000 watts worth of panels on a trailer and then just park it in your driveway or in your front yard or in your backyard or whatever. It's not considered a structure
Right.
by the city because it's just a trailer. And you've got you can have a significant amount of power on that. So there's various ways that you can get around the city codes if you're wanting to do a DIY setup, and if you don't want to put them on your roof.
I want to bring up a good point that you mentioned about the solar trailers, because it reminded me of something, and I want to mention this to people listening, and if I upload this watching. There's plenty of material out there, and there's plenty of YouTube channels discussing solar and things. But one of my personal favorites, besides that, David's now going to upload more stuff, is a channel called DIY Solar with Will Pros, PROWSE, and I have seen him do those solar trailers and talk about it's not a structure, and he lives out in Arizona, so basically he has infinite. It's like noon at midnight. I'm just kind of joking, but they got plenty of sun in Arizona, and he puts on a trailer, and thousands of kilowatts that he can maneuver around different. Like he'll put it here in the spring, he'll put it here in the summer, he'll put it here in the winter to kind of maximize output. And then if he wants to drive somewhere, he's got a Tesla, and he has enough kind of electronic components that he could mount it up to the back of his Tesla. And if you wanted to go just off grid, be producing his own electrons and keep that thing going forever off grid. But that's a really good resource. He also has a website and stuff like that. I'm not being paid by him. This is not an official endorsement. You can go find, there's other people out there also doing really good job. But Will's channel, he goes over things like batteries, lead acid versus lithium iron phosphate. He talks about things when you're talking about solar electricity, and you're talking about your own generation of electricity and things like that. In terms of heating and cooling, insulation is important. That's a really good jumping off point to the other aspect of geeking out about solar and getting into solar and renewable energy and things like that in terms of energy independence, is that you start looking at the world and energy use way differently, and you start looking outside of energy use differently. Whereas you start thinking about, all right, I'm running this air conditioner. How can I keep it using the lowest amount of energy possible? Where is air leaking in and out of my room or of my home? How is the insulation set up? So little offshoots of solar production are things like insulation, for instance. If you are if there's watts just fluttering out into the atmosphere, wasted through little gaps in doors and gaps around windows, or you're like in my house, my walls are insulated with hopes and dreams, like not anything real. It's stupid how hot the upstairs gets, especially. You start thinking about those outside things about how to be more efficient. And it's not just about saving money or having, your system be most efficient. It turns into, you mentioned way at the beginning of this podcast, it's addicting. So this pursuit of energy and efficiency becomes addicting, and it's I'll say that on the kind of intellectual level, emotional level, whatever, getting into solar is not making this argument, at least for me, about like, oh, I'm gonna go hug some trees or save the whales or do whatever, which I'm all about the environment, don't get me wrong. But my main motivator in solar is just that it is such a fascinating technology and an area to get into, because it really makes you look at the world different. Have you experienced that degree?
I wanted to touch on that. So my system was originally, my total motivation, 100%, was to build a system for a backup solution. Like I said, I've had it in place now for pushing 2 years, I think, or at least a year and a half. And the thing is, I go in there every day and I look at the little screen and it shows me this power coming in from my panels. Mm-hmm. And I've come to where I like I'm constantly looking at it. It's like, look at all that free energy I'm making, And then, and I've got my little air conditioner running and then, after a while, and it works fine. And like I said, I'm not complaining about how it works or anything, but, suddenly I start thinking, man, I'd like some more of that.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And so now for the last few weeks, I've been trying to plan an upgrade where I want to double my solar input and I want to double my battery capacity and then, and whatnot, because now it has become like I've got this free energy and I want more of it. It's addicting looking at the little screen, seeing the number of watts coming in, and I want that number bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Because the more I draw from that, the less I'm paying to my my electric company. And even though this is not a big full house installation solar, it's actually interesting when you start looking at the math and you're like, it wouldn't take more than a few $1,000s, like I'm thinking like $2,000 or $3,000 for me to upgrade this to the point that I can start producing about 20% of my daily solar or my daily energy needs. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, that will actually get to the point where I'm going to see a difference on my electric bill. And that's not going to be a dramatic difference, but I think, for example, I could probably knock $60 to $70 because, my electric bill is like 325. Actually, this month it'll probably be closer to 400 because of the heat wave.
Yeah, in summertime.
But yeah, if I can knock 20% off that, that's close to $100 a month. So not only would it be a better backup system because I'm going to have more power available and whatnot, but it would also be to the point I'm going to start seeing visible savings on my electric bill, which and I'm still not grid tying this. The way I'm looking at this is for those that have seen the video, I installed a transfer switch on my breaker box. So I can literally just go over and say, hey, I want to run this circuit and this circuit and this circuit today off solar.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not grid tied because it's like an either or thing. Like that circuit in the house is either running off of shore power or it's running off solar. But the solar never at any point comes into contact with the utility grid, right? I mean, it's always it's isolating certain systems in the house and saying, hey, they're going to run on solar today. And so I'm going to install some more transfer switches, and that way I can allocate more of the breakers in my house to be on solar. And I still can't run my central AC even by doubling my capacity, but I think, again, I can allocate, I'm going to start running my refrigerator off solar. I'm going to start running my network closet off solar. I'm going to start running, all these other appliances. And I've got the window unit air conditioner, of course, I'll keep that running. And, and during the winter, we usually have little space heaters around the house in winter anyway, because, my wife always keeps one in her room because it's too cold in there and whatnot. Well, that room is going to be on the breaker, so it's going to be powered by solar. That little space heater be powered by solar, so on and so forth. Anyway, point is, it's kind of fascinating. You start looking at your entire home's electrical system and you're like, what can I power off of solar? And of course, if you had a big enough system, you could power the central AC, but, I think my ultimate goal, which I can't get my wife to agree with yet, is I want to install
HOA wives.
I want to install a couple of mini splits in the house. And actually, I have two reasons. I've been wanting to do that for years, even before solar, simply as some redundancy, because we've been living here like 20 years. And I think we're on our third air conditioning system. And they, they last anywhere from 6 to 12 years, and then they die, and then you got to replace them. And they break down. Like, I don't know. I feel like we're kind of lucky. We've gone like 3 or 4 years without an AC breakdown. When that happens in the middle of summer, your house becomes uninhabitable here in Texas. I mean, it's like if it's like 105 outside and you go 2 days without air conditioning, you might as well move out until it's fixed. And I got the window unit. I can keep one room cool, but if I had a couple of mini splits in the house, that would not only offer redundancy to a central AC failure, because now I could keep like half the house cool, but it would also be an excellent way to use the power from your solar. And the great thing is you can get, for those that are familiar with SEER ratings, the seasonal energy efficiency ratings on air conditioners, I think like my main unit in my house is like 12 SEER, and you can get mini splits up to 33 SEER. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, they are so much more efficient. So like
and the active heat pumps.
Yeah, and they have heat pumps too. Yeah,
Mhm.
and so the point is, like, you could pump 500 watts of power into one of these mini splits, and it would be like pumping 1,000 watts of power into your home air conditioner system,
Yeah.
because they don't need as much power to accomplish the same amount of cooling.
Yep.
And so, in many ways, it's like amplifying your solar capabilities to some extent, because you're just, you could, in fact, I made the argument. I said I could run these mini splits off of mains power and still save money.
Yep. Yeah.
but if I can run them off solar, even better,
Right.
And but yeah, my wife says those are ugly and she doesn't want me to install them, but we're still working on that.
Still having that conversation.
But
I just want to point out real quick that mini splits, while they are becoming more popular in the United States, I want to reiterate for a lot of our international listeners to this. It seems like I love my audience. It seems like I have so many international people reaching out. Kenzo, shout out to Kenzo. He reaches out from the Netherlands. I have Peter in Japan, Anderson down in South America. Like Asaf in Israel. Like they're all over the place. But I want to kind of reiterate, because we're in Texas, and I think it's fascinating for a lot of listeners, and you have viewers all over the world too that live in kind of northern Europe or even the northern United States, that maybe, and they live there their whole lives, and they don't, just as much as we don't understand their climate because we haven't experienced it full time, there's a lot of misunderstanding about Texas climate too. People don't think it snows down here. It snows sometimes down here. I remember you had a comment on your thing. Well, what about snow on your panels? Like, well, it'll be there for a few hours before it melts away. It's not really a huge deal, but it does snow. And just to the point, what am I got? Mini splits and air conditioning and things like that. It's not, when David and I say that not having air conditioning quickly becomes life-threatening, that is true. And there is legalese written into contracts, and when you rent places, like rent apartments and things like that, that while air conditioning 90% of the time is a luxury or unnecessary in places like Northern Europe or up in Massachusetts or Maine or something like that, down here, like a power outage, if you were in Maine in the summertime, you're in Portland, Maine, and the power goes out, like you're going to need some blankets at night in August. Like it can get kind of chilly in the 60s or so, sometimes in the 50s up in northern parts of the United States. Down here, if our power goes out, that means we don't have air conditioning, and that's when people die. People die all the time, not in like waves of thousands, but when people don't have access to air conditioning here, it's life-threatening. Happens all the time in northern cities that have heat waves, and like Chicago, I remember recently went over 100 degrees, and you hear a dozen deaths of infirm and elderly and things like that. But in Texas, that's all the time. That's every summer. That it's air conditioning is not some luxury. It's like a CPAP machine. It's like life support. It's something that people need, especially if you're weaker immune system or you're compromised in some way. It is absolutely critical. The same thing as heat in the wintertime. In colder climates, you need it. So any sort of way we can do things, any sort of way we can make a backup plan to keep those life support systems going in a power outage is a great thing. David is coming at his solar array setup from, it's important to note this, backup first. So when you talk about cost and investment and people say, oh, it's not free money, stuff like that. Well, it all depends how you think about it. And if you're going for backup first, then it's no different than investing in other things like natural gas generators and things like that.
Yeah.
It's just like a cherry on top. It's just a nice little if it's backup first, it's a nice little bonus that you can actually use it to recoup the initial investment. That's the real point I wanted to make, is that we need to have AC here, and we're setting up our solar systems, me too, as backup first, as keeping us alive first, and having electricity first, not depending on the infrastructure second, not depending on gas second. We have gas. I've got a way of generating electricity from gas, but all the benefits, the cost benefits of recouping energy and using it to like offset electric cost, that's just that's just bonus. But that's not the entire reason why at least we started these systems. So, oh gosh, we've been talking a long time, David. This is not even a drop in the bucket compared to our phone conversations. We'd be like, hey, you free?
Yeah.
I've discovered this new thing about solar energy. There's one little area I want to talk about as we wrap up here, because we've covered a lot of ground here. But I want to cover just a little bit of technical things, because what I don't want is somebody to listen to our conversation and then dive in headfirst to this and be rigging up, 1,000-watt solar setup with like 24 gauge speaker wire. You're going to be in for a bad time. And this goes part and parcel to, it makes you think about things differently, up into including like gauges of wire and things like that. And it depends on the voltages and different places of the system. Make sure you do your homework. Knowing Ohm's laws is critical. I call it I per epper ear. The way that watts relate to volts and amps and watts and how it all relates. It's a very simple equation. You're going to be using those all the time. And then reference, okay, I'm sending, for instance, as a theoretical, I'm sending 500 watts to the inverter or to the charge controller, 500 watts at, let's say, 14 volts, at full tilt. You do the math on that for the amps. Okay, for the length of wire now that I need, what gauge do I need to safely run that many amps at that many watts at this many volts to a charge controller, and vice versa? Don't be running a 2,000 watt inverter off of thin little tiny speaker wires. Make sure that if you're running a 2,000 watt inverter on a 12 volt battery, that you've got beefy enough wires. I can't stress that enough. In like a safety shut, if you're doing it super DIY like I'm doing, having a kill switch like at the battery ready to go to kill the whole system all at once, battery and panels, have kill switches and have an inline fuse. Have some safety measures. Do your research on gauges of wire depending on all the electrical parameters and then the length of the cable run.
One thing that can mitigate a lot of this is to go with an all-in-one system like I did, because it's all integrated. The only thing you have to worry about with that setup is the wires from the whatever system you get to your panels. And the good news about that is, especially if you're doing a small run of panels like I'm doing, they have those MC4 connectors on the solar panels, and you can go on Amazon and just buy MC4 extension cords, and they're usually pretty beefy because they're meant for massive solar panels. And if you've got a small setup like mine, like with like 4 panels or something like that, it's going to be more than enough, and you're not going to have to worry about that kind of thing. So that does mitigate some of that a lot, doing that. But yeah, I mean, you're also going to need to figure out, you can only plug so much into these things. I mean, of course, the great thing is like they're gonna shut off if you plug too much into them, and they can't handle the amps. They're gonna shut off and give you an error message. But
the all-in-ones, the all-in-ones, and that's what I'm saying is, if you go DIY route like me, you got to be extra careful about your safety, systems in place versus an all-in-one Bluetti, where if it's rated for 700 watts from solar and you're pumping in like 750, it'll warn you and it'll disengage that circuit automatically. And the wire gauges, to let people know what to kind of expect, I'll use the panels to the charge controller, because that is one link of the chain that we both have in common with our setups, is we both have panels with wires coming off them going to our devices. Yours is an all-in-one, mine goes into a controller and out to different things. But the common thing we have is the wires from the panels. So typically what happens is you can get it. It all depends on the Ohm's laws and the ratings, but typically you can it's smaller gauge of wire, thinner gauge of wire is required for higher voltages. It depends on amps a lot in the resistance, going on there. But that's my point is, I've got 780 watts outside. I'm doing a regular, pretty short cable run. So I generally lean towards, if at all possible, going a little thicker, a little heavier gauge wire if possible. And what David said is most of all the stuff is MC4. That's the type of connection now. And you'll see when you go to Amazon and you're looking at like, well, is it copper plated over tin or is it full copper kind of deal, whatever you're researching, you'll see the power ratings. And typically, like my cables say, it can be used in up to 1,000-volt systems. So just pay attention to the kind of the ratings of the wire. Don't try to I'm doing all this as a disclaimer to save my bacon, because I don't want someone going out and buying a 200-watt panel and then hooking it up with thin little speaker wire and then basically turning it into a light bulb filament and burning their house down or causing some sort of damage. You're dealing with electricity here, and I can't stress that enough. You not only are dealing with electricity, you're dealing with deep cycle batteries that if you were to complete a circuit in the wrong way, you're getting thousands of amps theoretically that could go through your body and kill you. Like that, this is, you're talking about high voltages here. Typically you're talking about high capacity batteries. So just be really careful with what you're dealing with. And even with all-in-one systems, I'll probably get an all-in-one at some point, in the next few years. But if you're hooking up the solar panels, just be cognizant, that's a big word, of how you are hooking things up and the cables that you are running in between the devices. Just do your research, be careful with it. Don't blow yourselves up or electrocute yourselves. Do you know this off the top of your head, David, before we start wrapping up? The voltage required to break skin, isn't it like 24 volts or 30 volts before you start feeling a zap? I know tasers run at thousands of volts, like very low milliamps, but
I've touched 12 volts many times and I've never felt anything, like car batteries and stuff like that. But I have felt a little buzz from 24 volts before.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably roughly the threshold where you start feeling it
with dry hands. If you're wet and the salt on your skin has created an electrolyte, you can absolutely kill. If you walked out of the pool, a salt pool, like a salt-based pool, not chlorine or whatever, because I'm not sure the electrolytic, abilities of chlorine. I'm sure it exists. It might be great, but I'm just saying, if you're covered in salt water and then you just go to a car battery and like grab onto the terminals, I don't recommend that.
An easy comparison would be saying, stick a 9-volt battery to your tongue, and you're going to feel it. But to your dry skin, you're not. And,
That's perfect. Are there any other kind of points you want to mention? We've covered a lot of ground here.
Well, safety wise, if you're using lead acid batteries, which I just wouldn't recommend these days, this is 21st century, but if you're using those, they do leak hydrogen gas out of them, and you have to make sure you vent that from your house or your house could blow up. But if you're using lithium batteries, which I totally recommend, then you don't have to worry about that.
And any battery you do use, especially lithium, keep them in a climate controlled. Make that a consideration of where you put your battery.
Put them in your hot garage, or during the summer, it's it'll damage the batteries. I mean, they won't blow up or anything. It's just they'll start losing capacity, and
that's what I'm saying. The risk of them like blowing up is relatively low. But I know from experience, because a lot of my power tools, like trimmers and blowers and drills and things like that, I've typically kept out in the garage, on the chargers running off solar. I've got a feed going out there to run my whole patio and water pumps and all sorts of things. You'd be amazed what you can run off of a panel array of just 780 watts. But anyways, we talked about that. The lithium battery packs, like the 18 volts battery packs and things like that, 20 volt, you store them inside. If the charger's outside, that's one thing. Like, okay, let them charge, outside, but take them inside. Ideally, all of it, charging and everything, will be done inside, but at least for storage, keep them inside, because your garage gets boiling hot. I mean, it can be 120 degrees in there. If it's 105 degrees outside, it could be 120, 130 degrees inside the garage. And your batteries are sitting there day in, day out over the summer. Just
anything over
degrading.
about 90 degrees is considered slowly damaging to lithium batteries. So,
do you have a sensor on your all-in-one that tells you battery temperature?
It doesn't tell me the temperature, but it will supposedly flash a warning if they get too hot, which I've never seen because mine's indoors. So
yeah, my
not
charge
only is it
controller
indoors, but it's in the same room with that window unit air conditioner, so it kind of keeps itself cool.
Exactly. My charge controller has a little probe that comes out of it. It's a temperature probe, and I just leave it sitting on top of the battery, and I can monitor at all times, and I can go tap my little panel over there and see what the temperature is. It's usually between 70 and 80 degrees on the battery, which is perfect. And that goes back to the conversation of longevity of lithium iron phosphate in general, is keep the temperature happy and then keep it within your kind of voltage specs on the top and bottom end, and you'll be good to go. What I hope comes out of this podcast is and broadcast is that I'm not looking to change the world here, and I'm not looking to convince anybody like you need to go solar. That's not what we're trying to do. We're simply discussing our fascination and passion for what is a very interesting aspect of science. But what I hope on the smaller scale, I hope to inspire people to do their own research. As always, with anything I bring up on here, it's not to get the solar bug in this case and then electrocute yourself and be like, well, David and Johnny told me to do this. No, we're just trying to get you down your own path, doing your own safe research. Not that I think anybody listening is ignorant enough to just start going haywire with wires and voltages and things like that. But I'm just saying, there's in the over an hour and a half that we've been talking here, we've only skimmed the very narrow surface of everything that has to do with solar energy and renewables. Haven't even discussed wind turbines that you can buy. We're doing a glancing blow to kind of wet your whistle. To try to look into these things yourself. And at least if you don't want to go the whole route of doing a DIY or all-in-one solar thing, at least you'll be a little less ignorant about something. And I think that goes a long way in society, and me personally, to just try to be, not going to be an expert on everything, but I can be enough less ignorant so that I don't think falsely or don't make false claims. Don't go out there and say, you can't run a hairdryer on this. Well, that's an ignorant statement because you haven't considered these things. And I don't blame the person for saying they can't run a hairdryer on this thing because it's ignorant. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It's an ignorant because you haven't thought of all the factors, and maybe it's not an area of expertise. So I hope that that this podcast leaves people just at minimum less ignorant about solar. What do you think?
Well, I think maybe the whole point of where we were going with this, and maybe I didn't do a good job of saying it, is that my system started as a backup. It was a utilitarian thing, but for some reason or another, after running it for a while, it has become a source of fascination. It's almost like a toy now. It's fun. I want to.
Keep tinkering.
I keep want to tinker. I keep want to expand it, make it bigger, and it becomes, like we talked about earlier in the podcast, addictive. Like it didn't seem that interesting to me when I first started, but now that I have it running, suddenly it's different.
And that's to be the
I
case.
think a lot of people, especially us geeks, they're, we probably experience the same thing. It's like, go out there and build something small, and you'll find that it's fun, and it starts you thinking about a lot of things. Like, what would it take to power my whole house on this? Why is not everybody doing this? Mm-hmm. Why are we still burning so much fossil fuels to make energy when you can clearly see how much energy you can make? And I should point out, I did some rough math earlier, and I meant to talk about this earlier in the podcast, but I was like, this is kind of back of the napkin math, but I was like, how much would it cost me to build a DIY system that could run my whole house day and night?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I landed on a number probably around $20,000 for, and that would it would handle the basic necessities of the whole house, including the central air conditioner and all that. There might be some scenarios where I would have to rely on the grid, like if it was overcast for a week, or a snow covered panels, weird situations like that. But for the most part, $20,000 could power my whole house. And then I did the math, and I'm like, that would only be like 5 years worth of paying the electric company, right? Yeah. It could literally pay for itself in like 5 years. And so, and of course, again, you could bump that up to like a $30,000 system and give yourself some significant buffer there. And again, it would still pay for itself in like 6 or 7 years. And it starts to make you wonder. It's like, why is not every house covered in solar panels these days? Because, if you look, like I've spent, like if you look at the amount of money I've spent paying the electric company over the last 20 years I've lived in this house, if I had set this up when I first moved in, I would be like probably $60,000-$70,000 ahead today. And then of course it doesn't even get started on the environmental benefits of that, but just from an economic standpoint, it starts to make you really think when you start seeing this system run day after day after day. And it becomes something I've started wondering, like, why is not every freaking house got solar panels on it?
There's something to think about there, and I'm really glad you mentioned it because I wanted to talk about it and just forgot. A question that people have to ask themselves, homeowners, if you're in an apartment, there's probably people listening in apartments that are like, well, none of this applies because I'm in an apartment. That's not necessarily true. A really good gateway drug to solar is going on Amazon and getting one of those like $30 21 watt, USB solar panel kits that you're supposed to like bring camping or clip on your backpack or whatever. What I did in an apartment with that setup was I used that little 21 watt panel and I faced it on the balcony to grab some sunlight. And I had a 20,000 milliamp hour battery bank hooked up to it and just kind of charging throughout the day. And then I take it into the bedroom at night and keep my phone charged on it and my tablet and things like that. So there are things you can do in an apartment to utilize solar energy. You are not going to offset your electrical bill by keeping your cell phone charged and your tablet charged every night, but it is infinitely rewarding and fascinating and interesting to get into solar that way. And that's a really easy all-in-one way to do it. Little 3-panel 21 watt solar USB charging thing, and then a battery and a little 5-volt cell phone battery bank. That's an awesome way to get started. But to the point I wanted to make, you're talking about cost and offsets, and why wasn't I doing this a long time ago? I'd be thousands of dollars ahead. Why doesn't everybody do this? One thing to consider, because it's where I'm at right now, I would love to convert my house to full solar. I would love for a reputable company to come out for the amount of my electric bill and just start putting panels all over my roof, inverter, all the stuff, turnkey. But I am not going to be in this house that long. And I know that in the next few years, I'm going to be moving to just within Houston, at least to a different part of the city. Point is, I'm not going to be in this house. And I've always maintained that a good time to invest in solar to the best of your ability, to the best you can estimate, is like when you're buying a house. And factor in the cost. If you really want to convert to whole house solar, factor in that 20 grand or 30 grand, whatever it's going to amount to with a solar company, whatever. Factor that, like, think about that as like a part of the mortgage, because it does up the resale value of the house. But like I mentioned, you have to kind of be as sure as you can that you're going to be in the house long enough to benefit from it. And I'm not saying necessarily that you're going to be paying a 30-year note anyways. You might as well, instead of paying an electrical bill on that, be just paying for making the payment on the panels instead, and you could break even in 10 years. You could break even quicker than that. Maybe it all depends on the area and your usage and things like that. But my point is, a consideration to make when going whole house solar is how long do you really plan on being in the house? It doesn't make sense to me to put a $30,000 investment into something you're just going to move out of and maybe never see the benefit. And when you're negotiating for the house, you don't know when you're going to sell the house. In a buyer's market, in a seller's market, there's all sorts of things to kind of consider before going whole home solar versus going the DIY route where you can theoretically take it with you to the next place.
Or have that solar trailer we talked about.
Solar trailer. Hook it up to the Bolt. Hook it up to the Bolt or the Tesla. Bring it to
your next house. Yeah.
Yep. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the future. There's just so much to it. We need to cut it off at some point. We covered a lot of ground. I will remind everybody that they can email me if they want, Johnny@geektherapyradio.com, or just go to geektherapyradio.com and got the contact form. It's not a mailing list or anything like that. It just dings my inbox. And all the social media, I'm doing my plugs, and I'll let you plug, David. Not that you need a plug on my friggin' show, but I've got Geek Therapy Radio, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that good stuff. Really, the best way to get at me is on Twitter. Like, that's where I can respond the quickest and see it the quickest. But David, what do you want to plug on my little rinky-dink video show?
I don't have any need to plug anything. I'm known as the 8-Bit Guy on YouTube. You can find me that way.
Yep. So. I have a feeling that everybody listening to the podcast knows. But if you're listening to the broadcast on KPRC 950 AM here in Houston, a lot of you probably know who 8-Bit Guy is, but some of you don't. So really, really go check out the 8-Bit Guy on YouTube. He has a website also. It's not just solar. I want to catch people in their cars and tell them that, who are just a casual listener. It's not just solar. It's a lot of vintage computing. His bread and butter, I don't want to speak for him, but what's made him a claim to fame is restoration. It's kind of an ASMR type thing where you watch him like retro bright keyboards and take a computer from 1982 and make it look and operate like it's brand new. And there's a lot of fun along the way. He programs games. Let's plug Petsky Robots and all the Planet X's that you can get. He makes games, and he's ported Petsky Robots right over to, or is it Planet X3 over to Sega?
Robots, to Sega Genesis and about 19 other systems.
Yeah. So it's he's into all sorts of different, I'll call it geekery. So we're just talking about solar today, but we may talk about, astronomy in another episode. I need to talk about
electric cars.
Electric cars. Woo! Don't get me started. It's an hour and 40 minutes into this recording. Don't get started on EVs and dispelling myths and truths and things like that. But anyways, David, thank you so much for being on Geek Therapy Radio.
No problem.